Welcome to this educational video on a straightforward model for understanding depression. There's much confusion about the nature of depression, and this is seen in policy debates. Several years ago, and I'll reference a blog in my assignments to you in relationship to some blogs to read, there was a big debate in the DSM as to whether or not they should eliminate the bereavement exemption. The bereavement exemption is the notice that if somebody is experiencing major depressive symptoms, but have recently, within the last 6 months, at various times, had experienced the death of a loved one, then those symptoms could be accounted for in relationship to that. The bereavement exemption raises a whole host of different issues about fundamentally how are people conceiving of depression, and that's what this video is about. What it offers is a proposed solution for conceptualizing depression by describing it as a state of behavioral shutdown, or a little more clunky, but actually in the language of the unified theory, a state of mental behavioral shutdown. What we're going to see from this is then, with the proper description of the state of being depressed, we can then divide people and their situations into three broad logical categories of depressive reactions, depressive disorders, and depressive diseases. And that will be stemming from the logic of the structure. To give you just a little bit of background about where this is located in the development of the unified theory, as many of you know, for my first job following my graduating from my doctorate, I worked at the University of Pennsylvania with Beck. And my primary responsibility was being program director, I was project director, I should say, of a major study that brought individuals in who had recently made a suicide attempt. And it was in the context of doing that study, working with Beck and his formulation of depression, working with people in psychiatry, and having sort of developed the outline of the unified theory, which really happens in 1997. This is 1999 to 2003. I really engendered on an application of the unified theory to show how it can provide a way of understanding the core concepts and categories in psychology and psychiatry. I wrote an article that differentiated mental diseases from mental disorders, and central in that argument, or related to that argument, is ways in which we conceive of the concept of depression, which, as we will see, is a very complicated construct. And it's because we lack an overarching frame of understanding that we struggle so much in our capacities to really categorize different kinds of symptom presentations that may have very different causes or presentations. So let's talk briefly about what we mean in relationship to depression, and think some about the nature of the confusion. So in modern terms, we use this word all the time. So for example, somebody might say, oh, it's been raining for 4 days and this weather is making me depressed. What do we mean when we say that? Or perhaps more seriously, I always felt very depressed after we lost the championship game. We then make comments like, although he acts okay on the surface, deep down he is depressed. She often feels depressed about her life. She suffered a major depressive episode after she lost her job. He was hospitalized with melancholic depression. We'll return to that term. What I'm going to suggest here is that there's a continuum with also some reasonable divisions. So one division is going to be in the colloquial folk psychological use of the term depressive reaction. So this is just an experience of a depressed mood that may last for hours or mild frustration for a bit of time, maybe a couple of days, usually tied to a series of events that haven't gone that well, and then you just, relative to your normal mood, you feel discouraged, grumpy, negative. Okay? The term is used in that way. And clearly, we would not want to identify these as examples of mental illness. On the flip side, or on a more severe level, in terms of basic severity, or a slightly different meaning, we see individuals who struggle with depression as a fundamental part of their life, and it's tied up with their general feelings of life satisfaction. It's tied up with their general, what Zach Stein might call the nature of their ensoulment, which means they're sort of how they deeply relate to their emotions, what are the image and meaning that they have in their lives. And then finally, we see sort of pervasive symptoms that then dramatically impact somebody through and through, including their overt presentation. And so there is, at some level, a degree of severity with these breaks, and that is and I think we can see that in our everyday common sense language. And what I'm going to argue is that a deep understanding of mental behavior, which the unified theory argues that it can provide, sets the stage then for where this dimension of severity comes from and why we might want to divide up this sort of, if we had these 6 bullets into 3 different categories. So there's an enormous amount of struggle basically trying to get at what we should consider the true nature of depression to be. Is it just a normal reaction to adversity? Is it a normal reaction to being, saying, marginalized or disempowered, or living on the street, or losing one's job, or being divorced, or being lonely, and feeling that life had so much potential and that it could never be realized? Is it a psychological disorder, or is it a biological disease? So these are 3 broad frames of reference that are operative in everyday terms, and they're also operative in different scholarly domains or within scholarly domains that elicit debate. So the answer of those 3 questions fundamentally depends on who you ask. So if you go to biological psychiatry, many people there have a view of depression akin to what Judd described as most people in our society no longer view depression as a mysterious sickness of spirit or emotional weakness, but rather as a disease of the brain and an important health problem. Okay? So one frame is that depression is a disease of the brain. There are behavioral psychologists, social workers, and other mental health professionals who basically argue this is completely erroneous, that we should actually consider it to be a myth that the depression is a disease of the brain, and argue that there are patterns of psychological functioning. I actually have a presentation where I have 6 or 7 more quotes from psychologists, psychoanalysts, social workers, feminists, multicultural theorists, indigenous psychologists, who all offer particular angles on the concept. I shortened that and here emphasize the debate because when I gave this lecture, I think back in 2017, the lecture that these slides are based on, there was much debate about the bereavement exemption. That actually may go back a little further than 2017. I can't really recall. But anyway, in the context of the debate about the bereavement, like whether or not we should eliminate the criteria, which I actually argued we should, but it actually was in conjunction with a fundamental redefinition of what we meant by the term depression. Okay. Is that when is depression a mental disorder and when is a reaction to difficult life circumstances? All of these different, there are societies as well as Alan Francis. I guess actually, yeah, it's a lot longer in 2017. If that's actually, yeah, I guess it would be DSM-5. All of these individuals weighed in. with different opinions about if the depression is clearly tied to, say, the death of a child, and somebody is 2 months into a death of a child or 6 months into the death of a child, because that, I believe the data are indicative of somebody who loses a child. That's the hardest death or most likely death to result in a complicated bereavement that would be associated with depressive symptoms. Should we think of this as a mental disorder? So just to continue with our frame of understanding here, a couple of sentences, statements. We actually, Maria Fay, Panizio, and I, for her master's thesis, she was a doctoral student, Ken's advisee, who recently defended her dissertation this past year on the concept of personality disorders. She was here for her psychological sciences degree, and in the context of that, did with me a master's thesis, a great master's thesis, that explored practitioners' beliefs about depression and asked things like, on a 1 to 7 scale, what do you endorse this statement? So do you endorse the idea that depression is a disease of the brain? Depression is a normal reaction to an environmental stressor. Depression is caused by maladaptive psychological patterns. If a person is grieving, they should be exempted from being diagnosed. It's a myth that depression is a disease like cancer. Given that depression is biological in nature, people are not responsible for having depression. Depression arises not from being able to, as a result of being able to not meet the socially constructed standards of the good person. This was from a quote from a social constructionist who looks at power differential. So we took all of these and we asked the results. In fact, in a separate presentation, we shared all those results. The implications of how we answer this are enormous because depression is found by the World Health Organization to be the leading cause of disability worldwide, and is one of the great major contributors to the global burden of disease, put in quotes here, not by the World Health Organization, but by me, because if we don't agree that depression is a disease of the brain or a medical disease, then that raises all sorts of questions. The bottom line here, folks, is that so many areas of the social sciences, humanities, and psychiatry, psychology, social work, we have a very, very central concept that has enormous implications that then is come at or angled at in a wide variety of different domains, by a wide variety of different domains, that has lots of serious implications for how we think about this condition, and there are lots of broader implications. So for me, I come at this because I fell into the rabbit hole of asking the question of what is psychology, and then realized just how fragmented the field is. And because we don't have a frame for answering the question, what is psychology, what we instead have is a fragmented pluralism of different paradigms, models, and ideas. That sets the stage for us to be enormously confused about things like, well, what is a person? How do we understand psychopathology? And in this instance, I apply that lens specifically to the concept of depression. And so what I'll be sharing with you now is the behavioral shutdown model. And I really want to emphasize that I'm proud of the fact that the behavioral shutdown model is so commonsensical. Okay. And I really want folks to sort of slap themselves upside the head and say, well, of course, and why didn't I think of that? And how don't we agree on that? That's what I'm actually after. And then think about how many different perspectives there are and how serious this condition is in terms of its implications. And that's what a lot of what the unified theory is about tweaking much of what can be found in relationship to common sense, but then doing so and putting it together in a network of ideas, well, that allow for coherence to be generated. Coherence meaning harmony between various ideas that allows for good sense making. So, where does the behavioral shutdown model come from? Well, it comes from the unified theory of psychology, and which I published the meta-theoretical frame for psychology as a meta-theoretical frame in 2011. By meta-theory, I mean that if you adopt the 4 key ideas that make up the unified theory, that's the tree of knowledge system, justification systems theory, behavioral investment theory, which as we'll see is particularly relevant, and the influence matrix, you can then assimilate and integrate the major paradigms into a coherent language system and a theoretical system that weaves together the key ideas and gives rise to a more coherent whole. My current book, The Problem of Psychology and Its Solution, shifts the focus from the meta-theoretical into what's called the metaphysical. And the metaphysical is then focused on the actual core concepts that define the field. Most centrally, what is science? What is, and in particular, what is behavior and mental processes? And this presentation on depression relates to that because what it does is it shows it is really much more closely connected to a definitional conception than it is a theoretical conception. A theoretical conception is actually more abstract and relates to underlying causes. A definitional system really is about connecting to what it is that's empirically observable and developing concepts in categories that align with what is empirically observable. At least that's the descriptive metaphysics that I'm currently in the process of working out. So from the perspective of the unified theory, we need to answer the question, what is depression and why is it part of the human condition? And here's the answer. Depression is a state of mental behavioral shutdown. Okay. What do we mean by that? It's a fundamental withdrawing of psychic energy. And indeed, you actually have 2 broad systems of psychic energy, an approach system and avoidance system that actually reside on levels of arousal or inhibition. And the connection here is basically an approach arousal system versus a reduction in energy withdrawal system is a fundamental distinction that what depression fundamentally is about is a shift into a withdrawal of arousal averse system. Bottom line is people get passive and negative as opposed to being active and approaching and positive. So that's the idea. It stems from a more general idea, which is behavioral investment theory, which is the 3rd key idea in the unified theory, and serves as the fundamental linkage between life, our biological dimension of analysis, and mind, the basic animal psychological dimension. So behavioral investment theory is the joint point then between life and mind on the tree of knowledge. It's the idea that the nervous system in general, and brain in particular, evolved as a computational control center that computes the animal's actions on an energy investment value system built via natural and behavioral selection, or evolution and learning. Here's a picture of a bird. I'll give you an example of behavioral investment theory in action. Ethologists, these are scientists who study animal behavior in the wild, were exploring crows who would grab whelks, which are little shellfish, off the beach, and they would fly them over to an area of rocks and drop them so they would crack the shell. Okay. Now, that's a task that has this particular obvious goal orientation to get at the fleshy meat inside the shell. And the question is, well, how much energy would the birds expend, and how close would that be to optimal? So what you would have there is if you didn't drop the whelk shell from far enough up, it wouldn't break, and so you'd have to do it several times, and maybe it would break a little bit, but you have to drop it many. Of course, if you flew very, very high and dropped it so that it would break every time, it would be unnecessary to, say, fly 100 meters up and drop it, not to mention the fact that you potentially lose track of it. So there was an optimal level that one could predict that would yield the most breakage for the least amount of flight. The researchers calculated that, and what they found indeed was that there was a very close correspondence between what they would predict would be the least amount of effort to get the shells to break. This is an example of what's called optimal foraging theory, which basically suggests that animals, when they're in their natural environments that they've evolved to, will generally have a very clear trade-off between costs and benefits and attempt to optimally maximize the calorie and nutritious value of their foods relative to costs and risks. Okay? In other words, the hunting and food acquisition is a form of behavioral investment. To get a return on that investment, the animal must make necessary predictions, calculations about affordances and costs, and that guidance system is a way to frame the animal behavior, and really the structure of the nervous system is about processing information to realize relevant aspects of the environment that enable the path of behavioral investment to be charted and enacted. So behavioral investment theory is a neurocognitive functionalist view of mental behavior. I know that's a mouthful, but neurocognitive basically just means what you already know, and that's the nervous system. What does the nervous system do? It's an information processing system. Okay? This gives behavioral investment theory then gives rise to a view of the nervous system as that. This is a depiction of the cognitive aspects of neurocognitive. Neuro, of course, being the nervous system aspects, the fleshy aspects. The cognitive refers to the way in which information is processed, how it's hierarchically managed and stored and retrieved. And I won't go into this in any depth. You can look at the educational video on behavioral investment theory. But it is worth noting that on the right-hand side of that diagram, there are 4 different layers of neurocognitive processing. Of the sensory fixed action pattern motor response layer. That's basically an automatic procedural layer that you can sort of ingrain with habits and automatic sensory motor responding that requires very little consciousness. The second layer is what we call the operant experiential layer. That's noted by the PME. And this really is the layer of your motivational emotional energy. And this is crucial for depression because this is the layer that really gets shifted in depression, where the shift is from energizing the motivation for approach and the associated elements of positive affectivity. What you get is a shift towards a focus on avoidance, avoidance of loss of future elements, and a shift away from positive approach-oriented motivation. You then have, on top of that, you have a deliberation system. In other animals, this is all where the cortex is, which mentally manipulates possible scenarios to try to chart the best path of behavioral investment, and then deliberates on that and has to inhibit impulses and plan accordingly. That's the frontal lobe. And then in humans, and then mostly located in the left hemisphere, you get a whole nother layer of processing. That's that language-based processing that we see. For those of you that are doing things like Wechsler assessments here, you can kind of see the perceptual reasoning really assesses that third layer, that mental manipulation via pictures and holistic processing, and then verbal comprehension index, that's the linguistic comprehension and expression index. And then you have processing speed and working memory. So if you're familiar with the Wechsler domains, you can see how they would tie in and be able to be mapped by this diagram. Okay. So at its core, behavioral investment theory links 3 big ideas together. one of which is cognitive neuroscience. That's the idea that the nervous system is an information processing system that makes predictions about what's going to happen, develops schema, is hierarchically arranged, and functions as a computational control system. The other is B.F. Skinner's operant theory, which looks at the relationship between the animal and the environment and thinks about it in terms of commerce and the operating effect of the action an animal has in terms of what are the immediate consequences that an animal's action has, and those consequences create a behavioral selection feedback loop, such that certain consequences result in the actions being selected for, and other consequences result in them being selected against. It's this behavioral selection operating on the neurocomputational processes that really blends cognitive neuroscience and behavioral science into a package. And all of this is grounded on an evolutionary formulation. And that's a picture of Edward O. Wilson. He studied ants and also generated sociobiology, which really explored how evolution shapes the behavioral repertoires of animals, both in terms of the ways in which they evolve across the generations, and then how that sets up learning. So you have an evolutionary cognitive neuroscience foundation is what behavioral investment theory gets at. And it highlights that there are these two broad systems. One is a behavioral activation approach system, and the other is behavioral inhibition. Okay? In the first years, we were talking about the circumplex model of affect, and that emphasized that you have a positive affect and a negative affect, and an arousal and a calming down system. One that's active versus passive is a better way to say it. So behavioral activation really is an energizing toward the positive. And what this does is orient toward approach goals, expend energy to acquire resources, focus on the benefit side, generally activates positive affect, and is most obviously associated with positive reinforcement in an operant sense. On the flip side, you have, in terms of brain locations, generally more centrally located in the left prefrontal. Behavioral inhibition is more oriented towards avoidance goals, which are things you want to get distance from, costs, injuries, etc. They're about conserving an acquired resource. The focus is on cost, loss, or threat. Negative affects activated, punishment avoidance, and right prefrontal. Okay, so fundamentally, your control system is about sort of adding gas to get the good and putting on the brakes to avoid the bad. That's the easiest way to think about this. And you're constantly adding gas and brakes in a close felt sense. And here is the basic emotive motivational framework where you have active spend is fear to avoid, active spend to approach is desire, passive approach is relaxation, and passive conserve is depression. And what immediately you now see here, remember the question is, well, why is depression part of our primate system? Well, now we have a clear opposite. Just like why do some people have so much desire? It's sort of like, gosh, isn't it really weird when two people fall in love? It's like all they do is talk about how great the other person is. They all very energetic. They're in a positive frame of mind. It's like their whole mood is shifted. There must be something wrong with them. And the answer is no. The system by design, when there's an opportunity for a pair bond that has a long-term potential commitment, the system by design is activating a particular type of affiliation with sexual energy that creates a particular kind of excitable desire. And that is, so if excitable desire in a particular kind of opportunity is part of the architecture, then we can immediately see why the converse would be true. So that when your long love of your life leaves you, and that path of opportunity is no longer there, and you're reminded of all the glory that was and now will no longer be, we can immediately see why signaling shutdown and loss and a recognition that the path of behavioral investment has changed dramatically and requires recalibration is part and parcel of the architecture. So the behavioral shutdown framework, noting first and foremost that there is a state of behavioral shutdown that can be activated in relationship to a pattern of behavioral investment, provides a set of clear answers. And the primary purpose of the behavioral shutdown model is to clear a clear functional model of depression so that biological psychiatrists, clinical psychologists, social workers, and lay people can have a shared framework in terms of what this thing is and why sometimes it is appropriate to consider it a normal human reaction as just part of the architecture, why it often turns out to be a psychological disorder, especially in this day and age, and why it can, in certain manifestations, be thought of as a biological disease. So, a depressive reaction are shifts in negative mood that are adaptive responses toward loss, a path of behavioral investment that had a desired object that then is broken or absent or lost, or most dramatically, perhaps, like I said, a death of a child. The idea that the system would recognize that loss and need recalibration and do all sorts of different things that would result in the logic of a depressive shutdown is apparent. It's also the case that if we were to play out, especially in our modern world, and I keep saying that, I'm not going to get into too much details, but there are a lot of reasons why a depressive reaction in the ancient world or in a hunter-gatherer society might elicit a very different kind of reaction from the social environment, the physical environment, etc., that would minimize it, whereas in the modern environment, particular kinds of chronic stress states and particular kinds of social relations, particular kinds of beliefs about negative mood, all potentially set the stage for a vicious cycle. A vicious cycle ensues when the negative reactions, negative feelings are followed by negative reactions, either by the person or by others, in a way that engenders more and more negative feelings and more negative reactions. This is a vicious psychological pattern, maladaptive, where shutdown leads to more problems. Finally, there are the argument that there would be depressive diseases that arise out of some kind of malfunctioning neurobiological state, or a state whereby the depressive shutdown is so pervasive that it overrides other systems that are designed to counterbalance it. So the behavioral shutdown model immediately then allows us to see why there would be these three domains. So the answer of what is depression is yes, it is a normal human reaction and part of human nature. Yes, it certainly can be a psychological disorder. And yes, it can be a biological disease. The issue then is now we have the concept, it's a state of mental behavioral shutdown. But now the issue is, well, yeah, what is led up? What's the developmental? What are the driving features of the shutdown? And then we can functionally think of, well, let's put it in its functional awareness and response category, meaning, okay, what is the depression in response to? A depressive reaction might function to diminish behavioral investment in productive avenues, signal loss of resources, the need to reevaluate, communicate need of assistance, extort demands into others, facilitate submission and problematic competition, diminish problematic grandiosity. We can also think about it as an inevitable state in complete absence of productive avenues of investment that an individual then is particularly focused on preserving what little they have, defending against risks, and avoiding unnecessary losses. A depression as a psychological disorder is when the depressive reaction then generates a maladaptive response. So initially triggered by danger, loss, ineffectiveness, stress, but now we get a reaction that causes more difficulties, resulting in more depressive reaction, resulting in more difficulties. Anybody that's familiar with my formulation of a neurotic loop, which is the intrapsychic formulation of a portion of an individual who's very disappointed with their shutdown, doesn't know what to do about it, tries to control it, tries to blame themselves. And we can also think about this in relationship to the social environment, where somebody who begins to get depressed is then seen as kind of a drag, kind of a downer, not a lot of fun. What's wrong with you? This would then, both of these would create maladaptive patterns. And we see a cycle where thoughts, feelings, acting, and relating all drive the individual into a dead end. However, there's nothing here that we would look at the physiological level and say, oh, there's a broken biological system, there's a chemical imbalance or any indication, but rather the pattern simply is maladaptive. It's an entrenched maladaptive pattern that results in a vicious cycle of shutdown, as opposed to anything that would require like a physical or even the notion that there would be a biological shift. Okay. And again, because of the current mismatch of our current environment relative to the environment we involved in, there's a lot of reasons as to why strong depressive reactions may well be maladaptive. And then finally, there's a biological disease where depression reaction may be a malfunction. Okay, we can see this in a number of different things. So if you get a lot of mini strokes, especially in the positive affect system of your left hemisphere, people are much more vulnerable then to feeling depressed with a dominant right hemisphere system that's more activated negative. Well, if you got a bunch of mini strokes that knocked out your positive affect system, thyroid fluctuations, as well as we can start to think about people who are chronically depressed and engender a particular stress reaction, and they would have that orients them or situates them in a sick role that is really unable to be reestablished by particular patterns of positive investment. And so here you see a wide variety of different features, and this is a radically different and generally reserved for significantly more severe conditions. Although not necessarily, that is, somebody could have, in theory, a depressive disease like mild depression stemming from a hypothyroid that then, with the enhancement of the thyroid, take some synthroid medication, all of a sudden that is alleviated. So it's not necessarily the case that this is severity, but we can think certainly in terms of severity in relationship to being relationship to broken biology. This gives rise to a classification that I prefer to distinguish neurotic versus melancholic depression, and I'll share a blog with you on that. So a neurotic depression is a low-grade negative mood, low life satisfaction, often mixed with anxiety, tied to stressors. There might be some loss of pressure, but also can be hidden. So this is the most common presentation that we see in an outpatient setting. We treat neurotic depression. You might get a persistent depressed disorder, depression with adjustment disorder with depressed mood, or a mild, maybe moderate major depressive episode meet criteria here. In contrast, melancholic depression is really a complete neurophysiological behavioral shutdown. You see psychomotor retardation, significant disruption in biorhythms like much less sleeping, much less eating, massive anhedonia, serious change in functioning and coping. That's a way then of thinking about the kinds of depressions that you see if you engage in, you work in an inpatient hospital, and the level of impairment of somebody's in a severe major depressive episode. That a psychiatrist would identify as a severe MDD. Note there's mild MDD, which is kind of an oxymoron, but there's severe major depressive episode. And I've certainly seen people, basically can't get out of bed. Certainly it'd be very difficult to do any psychotherapy with. Generally, you want to do just basic behavioral activation and support, very minimal goal setting, and anything that they can find any little pleasure in to give immediate feedback with. That's not the case of most individuals in outpatient psychotherapy. So what are the advantages and implications of this? It provides a simple, easy, functional conception of depression, readily understandable, integrates various theoretical on a brain-behavior relation, allows a broad, clear conceptual framework for differentiating depressive reactions from depressive disorders and depressive diseases, and shifts the focus on what's the cause of behavioral depression. So notice we're not now, is it a disease or is it a reaction? It's depression is a state of mental behavioral shutdown. Now we can see the functional relations between what has happened, who the person is, what the context is, what the future holds, or potentially, and then that situates then the secondary classification of the shutdown as either a reaction, a disorder, or a disease. So the bottom line is depression describes a state of mental behavioral shutdown. Remember before I saw the difference between sort of a theory and a metaphysical conception. A metaphysical conception, when it's done right, then anchors your concepts in categories with clarity. So this then says, hey, we've been talking about this all wrong. We need to describe the state of behavioral shutdown. And then we can shift the focus in relationship to activity, phenomenology, physiology could be added here. and recognize that what we see is a shift in negative valence and withdrawal, that we can think about the functional causes of that in the person, environment, developmental transaction, and that gives us a classification that I believe does justice to the complexity and enables us to move in a much clearer and grounded way between psychology, psychiatry, and other professions, as well as the population in general.